Thank you. Well, I have to thank you all for coming out because it is midwinter and it's very, very nasty and sort of cold. So I'll try to do my best to turn what is basically a depressing lecture into something that'll be a little uplifting. So thank you for inviting me here. It always feels like a homecoming when I get to stay at Quarry Farm, which Susan Crane called Do As You Please Hall, although I think Joe gets a little nervous when I take her literally. My presentation this evening will necessarily invite us to think about Twain's childhood and his relationship to his father. Here, I want to put my timer on so that I don't end up boring you too long. His relationship with his father, John Marshall Clemens. But my interest is less in the biographical than the literary and the cultural. I'd like to link those early experiences first to the stories that Twain shared with us, and then to the stories that he didn't, couldn't, or wouldn't tell. This is, I think I'm becoming a lounge singer suddenly. Chances are you can, it's falling. Okay. This means I get an extra 3 minutes at the end of my, okay.
Of course it does.
Specifically, we'll read a bit from the Morgan manuscript of Pudd'nhead Wilson and look at just one moment where Twain struggles with his father and with the white manhood he represented. It's written into a text that he will never fully be able to publish. But since you're going to hear a lot from me tonight, I actually thought that it would be good, and knowing that I have some excellent readers and some, probably former teachers and professors here in the room, a couple lawyers, I'd like to have a couple of you help me read some of the handouts that I gave you. You should all have them. I forced Ray to do the first bit. So if you can look at the first page, this is from a collection called Hannibal something and Huck. I don't know. I can't remember what it's called. Terrific, though. Definitely get it. And this is an unpublished sort of reflection of that Twain shared of his mother, Jane Lampton Clemens. So I've asked Ray to read the paragraph that ends on page 50, ending with, "will not be able to pay for it." And I'm wondering if someone could read on page 51 from the very first paragraph just down to the 470 for 20 years. Would anybody like to volunteer to do that one for me? We're just setting the stage for don't make me come down there, all right?
It's just like my class.
I know. Give me a good, anybody want to read? Thank you very much. And ma'am, what's your name? Kay. Kay, A+ for you, all right. Okay, Ray, want to start us off?
Okay. It is commonly believed that an infallible effect of slavery was to make such as lived in its midst hard-hearted. I think it had no such effect, speaking in general terms. I think it stupefied everybody's humanity as regarded the slave, but stopped there. There was no hard-hearted people in our town. I mean, there was no more than would be found in any other town of the same size in any other country. And in my experience, hard-hearted people are very rare everywhere. Yet, I remember that once when a white man killed a Negro man for a trifling little offense, everybody seemed indifferent about it, as regarded the slave, though considerable sympathy was felt for the slave's owner, who had been bereft of valuable property by a worthless person who was not able to pay for it.
Okay, I'd like you to just kind of let that echo for you a little bit. And we're going to talk about this tension between being soft-hearted and hard-hearted, and how Twain is measuring the values of his community. Okay, would you want to hit us with the next one?
And you're talking about the top of page.
Yep, my father was, yep.
My father was a humane man. All will grant this who knew him. Still, proof is better than assertion, and I have it at hand. Before me is a letter nearly half a century old, dated January 5th, 1842, and written by my father to my mother. He is on a steamboat, ascending the Mississippi, and is approaching Memphis. He has made a hard and tedious journey in midwinter to hunt up a man in the far south who has been owing him $470 for 20 years.
Okay, so again, I want you to hold that memory, and we'll be looking at that when we get to the very end of this presentation and looking at Pudd'nhead Wilson. Okay, so let's look at a little bit at the life of John Marshall Clemens. So here we have a few of the facts that give us a skeletal portrait of Twain's father. We might take a moment to wish the Clemenses a happy anniversary, though I don't know that either one of them celebrated it very often. I'm sure we can all agree that the final detail, witnessing the father's autopsy, is, if true, a troubling symbol of the father-son relationship. Beyond these facts, we know that John Marshall Clemens surfaces in Twain's memory as a kind of perverse muse, both inspiring his ambitions and haunting his dreams. In an 1870 sketch published in The Galaxy, Twain describes his relationship with his father as a kind of Cold War. My father and I were always on the most distant terms when I was a boy, a sort of armed neutrality, so to speak. At irregular intervals, this neutrality was broken and suffering ensued, but I will be candid enough to say that the breaking and the suffering were always divided up with strict impartiality, which is to say, my father did the breaking and I did the suffering. Mapping the dimensions of this battlefield, with a particular focus on the life and character of John Marshall Clemens, has been an occupation for generations of scholars. In his 1952 biography, Sam Clemens of Hannibal, Dixon Wechter describes Marshall Clemens as, quote, ambitious, industrious, austere, corroded by worry, and haunted by the specter of poverty. And he theorizes that John Marshall's own scant acquaintance with either affection or family security had its signal effect on his fourth and most sensitive child. In Mark Twain and Orion Clemens, Brothers, Partners, Strangers, Philip Fanning describes John Marshall as, quote, a restless man, always looking for greener pastures, whose financial schemes were as prone to collapse as a house of cards. And in the first of his 3-volume biography, The Life of Mark Twain, Gary Scharnhorst writes that stern and austere were the adjectives Sam used most often to describe his father, sometimes in conjunction with taciturn, irritable, dour, and humorless. As newlyweds, the Clemenses began their life together with a move to Gainesboro, Tennessee, which Scharnhorst describes as, quote, the first in a series of moves that led to nowhere but misery and destitution. The struggles that John Marshall endured, most the result of his own ambition, inflexibility, and simple bad luck, did little to improve his temperament. Orion remembers his father as being, quote, irascible and hasty of speech, and having, quote, but one fault, the irritability of disordered nerves. Write that down. That describes like half the people I know. The less explicit, Orion's memories suggest the same combination of reserve and volatility that Twain remembers. This, quote, refined and kindly gentleman was also the man who would, according to Twain, strike our harmless slave boy Lewis for trifling little blunders and awkwardnesses. In his fiction, Twain resurrects this, quote, parochial Jehovah of his own youth, either as a yielding and honor-bound judge or as a drunken, vicious thief. No matter the incarnation, Pap Finn, Judge Driscoll, John Canty, Colonel Grangerford, Twain's fathers share a number of qualities. They treat children like property, use shame and intimidation to discipline, and if they are not the direct instrument of violence, they are nonetheless the source of it. By the time of his death in 1847, John Marshall had moved his family from Kentucky to Tennessee to Missouri, bought and lost homes, opened and closed businesses, and treated slaves like poker chips to be cashed in when liquid funds were needed. And they were always needed. What emerges from the memories of those who knew John Marshall Clemens is a portrait of a dual personality, at once fragile and stern, idealistic and foolish, studied and rash. In other words, John Marshall may have been the first Clemens to also be a Twain. Twain's fathers and father figures embody this divided nature. Pap Finn and John Canty are thieves, drunks, and terrifying brutes. They assault their children like nightmares, like monsters emerging from the dark. And you can look at, if you remember the novels, these fathers show up suddenly. They appear from behind a closed door. They confront their children out of a dark alley. At the other extreme are characters like Judge Driscoll and his brother Percy, Colonel Grangerford and Colonel Sherburne, men for whom violence is an expression of honor. Regardless of the bloodshed or the body count, they'll defend their principles or make sure their children will. Let's turn to Pap, Twain's most brilliant embodiment of American racism and its complicated roots in poverty, ignorance, and the culture of abuse, what we in the 21st century may term toxic masculinity. Pap seems an unlikely representation of the, quote, upright and gentlemanly John Marshall Clemens. Yet, in the struggle between Pap and Huck, we see the outline of Twain's competitive, combative relationship with his father and the values he represents. So I'm going to read some from chapter 5 of Huck Finn. And there's a lot to unpack here. What I want to focus on is this better than your father and that language of being better. I stood a-looking at him, and he sat there looking at me with his chair tilted back a little. I set the candle down. I noticed the window was up, so he had clumb in by the shed. He kept a-looking me all over. By and by he says, "Starchy clothes vary. You think you're a good deal of a big bug, don't you? Maybe I am and maybe I ain't." I said, "Don't give me none of your lip." Says he, "You put on considerable many frills since I've been away. I'll take you down a peg before I get done with you. You're educated, too, they say, can read and write. You think you're better than your father now, don't you? Because he can't. I'll take it out of you. Who told you you might meddle with such highfalutin foolishness, hey? Who told you you could?" "The widow, she told me." "The widow, hey? And who told the widow she could put in her shovel about a thing that ain't none of her business? Nobody never told her. Well, I'll learn you how to meddle, and looky here, you drop that school, you hear? I'll learn people to bring up a boy to put on airs over his own father and let on to be better than what he is." Now, if this were a highfalutin graduate class in English, one of the other things that I'd also point out is the echo, the way in which Huck repeats and Pap repeats. They're kind of mirroring each other. And one of the things that I hope we're going to talk about is this anxiety that maybe no matter how much you push against that father, you're going to become like him one way or another. Written into this scene is an unspoken question. Can Huck ever be better than his father? Can Sam Clemens? Can the sins of the father be exorcised by the child? Twain would have recoiled at how easily contemporary culture deploys the language of trauma to describe everything from a bad meal to a difficult conversation. I mean, I had a student tell me that they were traumatized by the pop quiz I gave. I'm like, oh, cupcake, life's gonna be hard, And he would have found our interest in those traumas to be self-indulgent. Nonetheless, Twain's representation of fathers and father figures reveal the extent to which he was the product of trauma, haunted by the violence of whiteness and masculinity. Before Sigmund Freud describes the Oedipal contest between father and son, or Jacques Lacan revisits that contest, and long before Derrida reminds us that, quote, "a ghost never dies, it remains always to come and to come back," Twain represents familial trauma in the language of the Gothic, particularly in his Mississippi narratives, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn, and Pudd'nhead Wilson. Twain stages the battle for self-determination as the son's hopeless struggle to exorcise the ghost of the father, or as the boy's effort to escape the fate of manhood. And it's worth noting here that Freud was reading Twain long before he wrote The Interpretation of Dreams in 1899, and he didn't coin the term Oedipal complex until 1910. I know this because I wrote my dissertation on Twain and Freud. And again, just to lighten the presentation, I was midway through the dissertation. I sent one chapter off to my dissertation director, and he said, "This is terrific. Well done. I have just one question," and this is before the computerized stuff. "Who's Fred?" I had for the entire chapter spelled Freud, Fred. So it was like Fred did this and Fred questions. He said it was horrible. I'm really glad that I mentioned it now and that we're recording this and putting it. Okay. Yet while Twain is imaginatively at war with his father, he's aware that John Marshall Clemens is just one foot soldier in what seems to be an army of like-minded white men. At least that's what the world of Hannibal feels like to the young Sam Clemens. In his autobiography, Twain admits, "A boy's life is not all comedy. Much of the tragic enters into it. What follows this observation is a litany of sudden, traumatic moments of violence, all of which little Sam Clemens witnessed and which haunted Mark Twain for the rest of his life. There was a slave man who was struck down with a chunk of slag for some small offense. I saw him die. And the young California immigrant who was stabbed with a Bowie knife by a drunken comrade. I saw the red life gush from his breast. In the case of the rowdy young Hyde brothers and their harmless old uncle, one of them held the old man down with his knees on his breast while the other one tried repeatedly to kill him with an Allen revolver, which wouldn't go off. I happened along just then, of course." Twain continues the list with descriptions of the, quote, drunken tramp who is burned alive in his jail cell, the execution of, quote, poor old Smar in the main street, and the death of a drunken invading ruffian who planned to assault a widow and her, quote, young and blameless daughter. As a child, Twain witnessed all these acts of violence, as well as many that occurred closer to home. John Marshall Clemens, the father whom Twain described as, quote, austere, of rigid probity, a sternly just and upright man, was also the man who beat and eventually sold the enslaved girl Jenny. The senior Clemens, quote, tied Jenny's wrists together with a bridle rein and administers chastisement across the shoulders with a cowhide as a punishment for being, quote, saucy. In Following the Equator, Twain recalls that his father, quote, often cuffed our harmless slave boy Lewis. And during his tenure as Hannibal's Justice of the Peace, John Marshall Clemens sentenced an enslaved man to be publicly whipped for the crime of owning a knife. Twain will occasionally romanticize the violence of life in the Wild West, yet these childhood memories resist such efforts. Twain's autobiography tells the origin story of Pap Finn and John Canty, just as it maps the bloody honor codes of Huck Finn's Colonel Grangerford and Colonel Sherburne. However, in these autobiographical writings, the racial identity of the men who generate this violence is present but unnamed. It's only in the fiction that Twain confronts and illustrates their whiteness, in everything from the fish belly white of Pap Finn's skin to the white linen suit of Colonel Grangerford, and in the fiction of law and custom that makes Tom Driscoll's whiteness visible and eventually invisible, and that's in Pudd'nhead. Little Sam internalized what he witnesses, and in a psychological twist familiar to abused children, he imagined that he was somehow responsible for it all. It is quite true. I took all these tragedies to myself. At the end of this long reflection on these brutal times, Twain describes how they affected him. Quote, "In all my boyhood life, I am not sure that I ever tried to lead a better life in the daytime or wanted to. In my age, I should never think of wishing to do such a thing. But in my age, as in my youth, night brings me many a deep remorse. I realize that from the cradle up, I have been like the rest of the race, never quite sane in the night." There are no ghosts or apparitions mentioned in this account, but Twain presents himself, nonetheless, as a haunted child, traumatized by the scenes of death and pain and by the uncanny specter of the white men who seem to relish them. Standing in the shadows, watching these terrible events unfold, the boy Sam Clemens unconsciously confronts an image of white masculinity that troubles his dreams as much as it disturbs and defines his adult imagination, particularly after he married Olivia Langdon in 1870. And there's been a lot of great scholarship on this. Barb Snedeker and Susan Harris and Laura Scandura Trombley, and I know I'm leaving off like 10 other people, who have really redeemed the memory of Olivia Langdon. He marries Olivia, and he began to represent his childhood as having been circumscribed by the violence of white men. And whether they're outlaws or judges, his own father or the drunks and tramps who populate the backwater of Hannibal, Twain represents the violence that adheres to them as the privilege of both their whiteness and their masculinity. Yet while he was clearly repelled by the brutality he associated with white men, Twain was also conflicted about how and how much of that story he could tell, particularly since he felt so deeply implicated by it. And here the uncanny functions both as a convention of the Gothic and a psychological imperative. Twain confronts an image of the father in which he recognizes a version of himself. In the preface to The Prince and the Pauper, Twain writes, "I will set down a tale as it was told to me by one who had it of his father, which later had it of his father, this last having in like manner had it of his father, and so on, back and still back, 300 years and more, the fathers transmitting it to the sons, and so preserving it." Twain originally planned to publish both The Prince and the Pauper and Huck Finn as a single volume. I think this is fascinating. For those of you who know the novels, he imagined one complete set. And if this summer you're thinking, maybe I'll do a little reading, read them back to back, because they're kind of weirdly the same story. Olivia encouraged him to separate them, and so he published them separately. He originally planned to publish them both together as a single volume, which suggests that in both texts, he's thinking of what the father passes on and what the son inherits, generationally, inevitably. He's thinking about the unavoidable fact of being his father's son. In the novels, Pap Finn and John Canty suddenly disappear from the narrative. Their fates are only partially revealed. This suggests that while Twain cast these fathers, in fact, almost all his fathers, as monsters and villains, he defers and displaces their moment of reckoning. Pap dies off stage, surfaces as an anonymous corpse, and emerges only as a memory at the end of the novel. John Canty disappears and is never heard from again by his newly roiled son, and Tom Sawyer's father is simply unmentioned and apparently unmourned. Twain's fathers become, in essence, ghosts. They haunt the text, remaining present in the narrative and absent from it as well. In the relative infancy of Mark Twain scholarship, it was a convention to assume that women were a problem for Twain, certainly not men. According to early critics, Twain was hampered and oppressed both by Olivia Langdon and by the prudish Victorian American culture she seems to represent. And I think I have enough time to read all of this. I wasn't going to, but since we've got you here and it's cold out, and I'm going to read it. This guy was just, I can't say it. He was horrible. Mrs. Clemens, who was far from being the votary of genius, so he's already accused her of not being smart, was not quite the votary of love either. She was, before all, the unquestioning daughter of that wealthy coal dealer of Elmira. Her husband might lag and lapse as a literary man, but when he fell behind in the race of pecuniary emulation, she could not help applying the spur. So in other words, she's a shrew, and she's just, earn more money. Well, as we know, she kind of hands over her fortune to save him. It was for love's sake that he put his head, so to say, into the noose. In his case, the matrimonial vow had been almost literally reversed, and it was he who had promised not only to love and honor, but also to obey. His loyalty was laid under further obligations by certain family disasters that followed his marriage, and by the weakness of his wife, a neurotic, hysterical type. At 16, through a fall upon the ice, she had become a complete invalid, confined to her bed for 2 years in a darkened room, unable to sit, even when supported, unable to lie in any position except upon her back, till a wizard came one day and told her with miraculous results to arise and walk. The contempt there is just unbelievable. But he's dead. The whole tenor of his new life was to feminize Mark Twain. Now, there's a real problem here. According to such a reading, Huck flees St. Petersburg to escape Miss Watson and the widow, not the brutality of his father. And when he lights out for the territories, it's to find a place where no girls are allowed. But even the most casual reading of Huck Finn in The Prince and the Pauper demonstrates that it's a type of violent, unyielding, unloving manhood that drives Huck out of America and off the pages of the novel at the end. When in the thralls of the DTs, Pap chases Huck with a knife, calling him the angel of death. Pap was all tired out and dropped down with his back against the door and said he would rest a minute and then kill me. So he dozed off pretty soon. By and by, I got the old split-bottom chair and clumb up as easy as I could, not to make any noise, and got down the gun. I slipped the ramrod down to make sure it was loaded. Then I laid it across the turnip barrel, pointing towards Pap, and set down behind it to wait for him to stir. And how slow and still the time did drag along. Now, I didn't include this, although it is in the book, first chapter. One of Twain's earliest memories is being left behind by his father in their home in Florida, Missouri. It's not until the father is like 30 miles away that he realizes he's left the 3 or 4-year-old Sam Clemens back home. The night starts to fall. He talks about feeling the ghost present. Well, this is Huck, in his trapped by Pap Finn. Twain stages a kind of standoff, one that Freud, or Fred, will eventually mythologize. Either the father will kill the son or the son will kill the father. It's worth noting that in these novels, while Twain is dispatching with fathers, biological or surrogate, he also struggles to imagine a different kind of father, a different kind of man. And I actually want to emphasize the struggle, and we'll talk about that in a second. In Huck Finn, Jim is offered as an alternative to Pap, but Twain also feminizes and infantilizes Jim and frames him in a minstrel mask. And we can talk about this a little later. I get very frustrated and just a little snarky and superior and annoying with other scholars who want us to consistently say that Jim is just a prince. There is nothing at all that should trouble us in the portrait of Jim. Well, read the book. He is at times represented in some very dismissive ways. He's also represented in loving ways. So you have this struggle. Can I imagine a different kind of man? Sure, but then you have Twain kind of pull back and undermine his own portrait. I inverted these. So that what came up first was Miles Hendon, but there's Jim. Miles Hendon is, like Jim, he functions as a guide and a protector to the young King Edward, but he's also a subject contained within a monarchical system. And again, if you think of these two novels talking to each other, there's this amazing moment when an Englishman talks about being an English slave. So you have Miles Hendon emerging from this system that actually gives us the Southern system of slavery. Finally, there is John Quarles, Twain's beloved uncle, on whose farm Twain summered for years. He appears to be a better man than John Marshall Clemens. Yet, as Twain's descriptions suggest, better is a relative term. He writes, "My uncle, John A. Quarles, was a farmer, and his place was in the country 4 miles from Florida. He had 8 children and 15 or 20 Negroes, and was also fortunate in other ways. Particularly in his character, I have not come across a better man than he was." Well, I think there's some room for improvement here. It's a relative term and tainted by the, quote, good fortune of owning slaves. In 2024, the extraordinary editors of the Mark Twain Papers and Project, led by Ben Griffin, published the authoritative edition of Pudd'nhead Wilson. The novel is an operatic, chaotic, fabulous cross-current of narratives in which Twain's fear and Tom Sawyer's playful transgressions take an ominous form in the character of Tom Driscoll, a white-skinned black son who kills his surrogate father and master. Of all Twain's published and unpublished works, this text contains his most intimate and complicated reflections on his father and his own tortured attempt to write the story of a better white man. Let's just review the plot, or at least one of the plots. There are like 12 plots in Pudd'nhead Wilson. Okay, so first of all, we have the enslaved Roxy who is 1/16 black. Her son Tom is 1/32 black. We don't know exactly who the father is. The suggestion, and it's Colonel Cecil X. Essex Burleigh. I can't remember the whole name, but we never meet him. He's kind of gone, dead. Her baby is as white as the master's and was born on the same day. Her, quote, master catches one of the slaves stealing and sends them down the river. And this is Percy Driscoll. That night, Roxy switches her baby for his. Tom grows up spoiled and cruel as the master. Chambers, who was originally the master, the actual white son, grows up strong and servile, a cowardly pest. Twain suggests that race is a fiction of law and custom. Tom eventually discovers his true identity and he rages against the whites. And he is vile and ashamed of his blackness. He eventually kills his surrogate uncle, Judge Driscoll. And this is, I think, just like an amazing image from the first, I think it's from the not from the Century edition, I'm not sure. But you see the illustrator has made Tom black-skinned, but actually he is, in the novel, light-skinned, if not white-skinned. Okay. Oops, I don't want to go there. In addition to the published version of Pudd'nhead, which is about 53,000 words, this edition contains the complete Morgan manuscript edition. So housed at the Morgan Museum in New York City for years and years, it was very difficult to sort of get access to it. It had never been published in full. That's roughly an additional 30,000 words longer. Much of this has never been published or seen by readers. Twain cuts and moves and pastes sections of the text. I was actually studying it when I was at the Morgan, and I contacted Ben Griffin, and I said, my God, there's X's, there's newspaper things, he's cutting things. I said he did everything but lick it. And he said, actually, he did lick it. There's some pasting in there. And I was like, were you telling me I was close to Mark Twain's saliva? It's exciting. Okay. So you have in the handouts that I gave you, these, right where it says do not reproduce, you have these are from the Morgan manuscript. These are 2 pages that really fascinated me. And I'm going to, as much as possible, read some of the section that is cut. So this never makes it into any edition of Pudd'nhead. It's something he's thinking about. At one point, Percy, finds out that his slaves have been stealing from him, and he sends one down the river. Twain adds this section onto that moment. Excuse me. We have been excusing the slave for stealing, but it is but fair to excuse the master for what might seem to us rather poor indications of the presence of humanity and softness in his nature. On a 3-week trip in, quote, the mud and slush of winter, Driscoll takes his slave, Jim, away from his, quote, humble black family and friends of his childhood to exile him forever in a far land. It never occurred to him that the poor creature had a heart in his bosom to break and left hearts behind him that could break. It was totally impossible for him to deal ungently with a white person who appealed to him for a grace, even a costly one. But he and his ancestors had been slaveholders, and habit and heredity had made it impossible for him to realize that the Negro was a human being. By name he was that, but it was only a phrase. In reality, it meant no more to him than it would mean if one could call a horse a human being. He was a humane and gentle-hearted man, in all cases where slavery had not blunted his perceptions. So I just want to sit with that for a minute, and I read a little more than what's up here on the screen. We're back to almost the introduction of Prince and the Pauper. This sort of hard-heartedness is inherited. He seems to want to say, I didn't know any better, right? We didn't know any better. And we hear this argument that he makes elsewhere. In this case, he's kind of looking at Percy Driscoll as the representation of, honorable white manhood, who is in fact doing something very generous. He's going to go out and he's going to forgive a debt of a poor farmer who can't repay him. But along the way, he sells Jim, and he sells him for $50. Percy writes home to his wife, "I could get no fair offer for Jim anywhere on my tedious and dreary journey. I cannot be encumbered any longer with Jim. He is valuable, but I will sell him, even if I have to take only $50. Okay, let's go back to where we started by looking at John Marshall Clemens. Did you want to throw something in?
No, I was just going to say, his own father.
Right, here we go, right? You're way ahead of me. So why don't you, you've got that section, if you turn to the section right after Kay was reading. And again, I'll look at the time. I don't want to keep you here too long. If we want to pick up right after where Kay was, $470 for 20 years. So this is Twain now. We just read this fictionalized version of Percy Driscoll. Goes on a journey, forgives a debt, sells a slave along the way, and kind of congratulates himself for it. Now he's talking about his own father. He has found this man, but he has also found this man is solvent and able to pay, but, quote, and this is from a letter written by John Marshall Clemens, and we don't have very many of those. It seems so very hard upon him these times to pay such a sum that I could not have the conscience to hold him to it. On the whole, I consented to take his note, payable the 1st of March next, for $250, and let him off at that. I believe I was quite too lenient, and ought to have had at least that amount down. And Twain says, "Is this not humane, a soft-hearted man? Even the gentlest of us have been plowing through ice and snow, horseback and per steamboat for 6 weeks to collect that little antiquity. Wouldn't we have collected it? And the man's scalp along with it? I trust so." Okay, before I read on, I want to share with you another part of the letter it's not in this particular memory. Excuse me, I just got myself out of order here. Here we go. In the middle of this letter, one of the things that John Marshall Clemens includes is, after I have the conscience to hold him to it, along the way he reports staying with a gentleman, M. Templeton, who invited me to his house. He is a rich bachelor who lives in a splendid house and has droves of Negroes. So, you have this strange this desperation in John Marshall Clemens. He's trying to collect a debt. He forgives the debt because he's got that rigid probity. And yet he's about to sell off an enslaved man while also dreaming of the wealth that another man has based on his accumulation of enslaved people. Okay, so let's go back to that letter. Is this not a soft-hearted man? Now, lower down on the same page, my father, proven to be a humane man, and listen to the contempt there, writes this, I still have Charlie. The highest price I was offered for him in New Orleans was $50, and in Vicksburg, $40. After performing the journey to Tennessee, I expect to sell him for whatever he will get when I take water again at Louisville or Nashville. And goes right on then about some indifferent matter. Poor Charlie's approaching exile from his home and his mother and his friends and all the things and creatures that make life dear, the heart to sing for joy, affecting him no more than if this humble comrade of his long pilgrimage had been an ox and somebody else's ox. It makes a body homesick for Charlie even after 50 years. So he's confronting the kind of moral failings of his own father. Editors Walter Blair and Dahlia Armand suggest that Charlie may in fact have been a horse. Quote, the price seems appropriate for a horse, but uncommonly low for a male slave, unless very old or in poor health. And yet when Twain reimagines this scene in the Morgan manuscript, the ambiguity seems hardly to matter. Quote, "It meant no more than it would mean if one should call a horse a human being." Twain assumes that his father would readily treat a person like an animal, in part because he has so often seen him do so. He cuffs Lewis, he beats and sells the enslaved girl Jenny, who traveled with him from Tennessee. He convicted Henry with the crime of possessing a knife, and he sentenced him to 20 lashes and a public whipping. John Marshall Clemens had dreams of living in a splendid house, supported and surrounded by droves of Negroes. And I could have done a different version of this paper where we looked at what Leland Krauth in a great book and Carrie Driscoll in a terrific article on Twain's Music Box talk about Twain's material ambitions, his desire to have wealth, but I thought I'd go for this instead. He dreams of living in a splendid house, supported and surrounded by droves of Negroes in the Morgan manuscript. Twain reflects upon the price paid by sons and slaves for whom this dream is a nightmare. In the Morgan manuscript, okay, never mind. I'll go back to, there it is. In the Morgan manuscript, Mark Twain cuts a large X across Tom's revenge story and Percy Driscoll's violation of the humble black family. It is as much a critical crossroads as an editing tool. It marks the spot of Twain's ambivalence to a history he wants at once to expose and to repress. It both resurrects and buries the memory of his father's betrayals and the shame he feels about them. More broadly, perhaps, the X highlights erasures that make possible the sleepy conscience of Dawson's Landing and an American culture that, like Mark Twain, would prefer not to remember what it can't forget. Thank you very much.